Well, hi there, friends. This is Brother Lauren. I'm coming to you from the study today here at the office. This is the second in our video series we're doing exploring the possibility of disaffiliation. So we as a congregation have that conversation together about the possibility of withdrawing from and leaving the United Methodist Church. As part of that, I thought we'd do well today to talk about how we got here. If in fact the United Methodist Church is going through a divide, if there is some sort of split happening, and it seems like there is some sort of split happening, well then there are good questions to ask about the why, and we'll get into that. But I especially want to take some time here today to talk a little bit about how we got here, where we were, where we are now, and how we got from there to here. So we want to look at some of those things that have precipitated this, those things that have led us to this point. Now we're not going to take a huge step back, but I did want us to take that slight step back to look at the General Conference 2019. In 2019 we had a special called General Conference. Now that General Conference actually came as a mandate from the previous full General Conference in 2016. Just a word of explanation for those of you who don't really remember the larger way our denomination works. In the United Methodist Church, we have a global gathering once every 4 years. That is the only group that can speak on behalf of the entire United Methodist Church. We call it General Conference. Each individual regional territory like Mississippi is an annual conference, because we meet every year for a conference in Jackson, or this past year it was up in Tupelo. That's our annual conference, the Mississippi Annual Conference. Each conference is a part of a regional territory called jurisdictions, and then all the jurisdictions gather together globally for what's known as General Conference. Every annual conference elects delegates, even number of lay and clergy. So in Mississippi, we elect about 5 lay delegates and 5 clergy delegates, and they go and are part of a gathering of worldwide delegates that are usually under 1,000 in membership. So though I think the last time we had one was 869 delegates at the General Conference. But they go once every 4 years, and they take care of things like the general budget, and they also write what's called our Book of Discipline, our Book of Church Law. It's those rules that are guiding and binding us as a local church, as an annual conference, even as a global church. There are covenanted rules for how we live together. Only the General Conference can make those rules. And again, they meet once every 4 years. Our last regularly scheduled General Conference was 2016. But in 2016, they came to a bit of a difficulty. The matter of homosexuality came up again. It comes up every 4 years at General Conference. And as they were debating and discussing it, the arguments got heated and things became difficult. There was some animosity that was growing, a hostility that was increasing. And so they decided to table that and to deal with it at a later time, so they could take care of all the other business that needed to be done at General Conference. And so they created a special commission to examine some possible legislation, proposals for how to resolve our ongoing difficulty and disagreement over matters of human sexuality in general, but particularly over the practice of homosexuality. That maybe we could find a way to resolve this once for all. And so they set aside a commission to study that and make proposals, and then they committed to have a special called General Conference before the next regular General Conference, before 2020, to be able to have some hope of resolving this matter of human sexuality and our disagreement once and for all. That was kind of the hope. And that commission met, and they came up with a couple of proposals, but their main proposal they put forward was what they called the One Church Plan. It was this idea that every church would get to decide whether it hosted same-sex weddings, and every pastor would get to decide whether he or she presided over same-sex weddings. And then every annual conference worldwide would get to decide whether they ordained self-avowed practicing homosexuals or not. each church would get to decide. We'd all be one church, but we'd all have individual decisions within it. In essence, it was another way of saying big tent Methodism. We're going to be a big tent, have differing and conflicting views within it, but it'll keep us all together in one church. It was called the One Church Plan. The bishops really thought that was a great idea, and they promoted it very heavily. But there was a second possibility that rose up. There were a lot of other ones, but the main second one that rose up was called the Traditional Plan. And it was to reaffirm the language in our Book of Discipline, and even to strengthen it and to give a bit more teeth to the accountability to help us live by it more fully. That was called the Traditional Plan. Those were the two main ones that went into that General Conference. And so they convened a special called General Conference in 2019 in St. Louis, Missouri. And as part of that, they spent 2 to 3 days prayerfully debating and discussing how we would resolve this matter. And in the end, by a matter of 54 votes, now I want you to hear that, not by 54%, but by a mere 54 votes, the Traditional Plan passed, and the One Church Plan failed. And so they reaffirmed our current Book of Discipline, and in the end, they strengthened it, and they gave it more accountability. And so they were able to reaffirm what we've believed for the last 54 years. What's been in every Book of Discipline since 1972, that the practice of homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching, and that we in the United Methodist Church do not ordain practicing self-avowed homosexuals, nor do we preside over same-sex weddings or host same-sex weddings. They reaffirmed that language and strengthened its accountability. In my opinion, what they did is they made it the most traditional, most biblical, strongest book of discipline we've ever had. And so that was the 2019 General Conference. And when that General Conference ended, boy, there were a lot who thought that that would resolve the matter. The hope was that that was the last time we as a church were ever going to have to speak to the matters of human sexuality. This was resolving it once and for all. That was the hope. Sadly, that didn't last very long. Not too long after we left that General Conference, it became very clear within the next few weeks and months that a lot of our bishops and our general church agencies and some of our conference leaders throughout the United States especially simply weren't going to abide by it. They said very clearly that it may be church law, but we're not going to do it. In fact, we simply will not enforce what the Book of Discipline says. It says it, but we won't enforce it. Others still just outright defied it. They not only said they wouldn't enforce it, they decided they were going to do something opposite of what the Book of Discipline said. Now, some places that was rather expected, like California, Oregon, Washington, those places that are part of the Western jurisdiction, in fact, the entire Western jurisdiction, basically made it clear that they weren't going to do that. They were going to be a fully inclusive church, and they were going to go on as if that didn't happen at the 2019 General Conference. But there were other places that were kind of surprising. Within a couple months, the bishop, the Board of Ordained Ministry, and the Cabinet of District Superintendents in the Iowa Annual Conference, they said that not only were they not going to enforce that current Book of Discipline, they were going to act as if the Traditional Plan didn't pass, and act instead as if the One Church Plan had passed, so that in Iowa, each church would get to decide whether they host same-sex weddings, and every pastor would get to decide whether they preside over same-sex weddings, and the annual conference would decide that they would ordain self-avowed practicing homosexuals. Now, mind you, that's not what our Book of Discipline says. This is the Book of Discipline. This is the last published copy of it from 2016. There's an addendum for the 2019 General Conference that you can find online. But despite what this says, this is our church law, they said they were going to do the opposite of that. They were going to do something else. Well, now that creates a problem. I mean, aside from what one feels about human sexuality and the practice of homosexuality, this is our church law. The General Conference, the only body that can speak on behalf of the entire church, the group that actually gives us the rules we live by as a denomination, they have spoken. They gave us that book of discipline. And yet our bishops, not all of them, but some of them, and some of the conference and general church leaders simply said, yeah, we're not going to do that. We're going to outright defy our book of church law. We're going to disobey the book of discipline. If you don't like it, stop us. Well, that creates a real problem, because if we're not going to live by the rules that we've made, what good is having the rules? If we're not going to abide by what General Conference tells us, well, then why even bother to have a General Conference? So it became clear very quickly after the 2019 Special Called General Conference that we had a problem. And what we did in 2019 wasn't going to work. And so later in that year, we were fortunate. A bishop from Sierra Leone, Bishop John Yambasu, who's tragically since passed away. He passed away in August of 2020. But back in 2019, after that general conference and its aftermath became clear, this bishop of Sierra Leone in Africa, he gathered together a handful of bishops, just 2 or 3, and he gathered together all the major representatives of the lobby and caucus groups throughout the United Methodist Church. Now, we have different groups that represent our theological perspectives. And so I'm about to use the words conservative and liberal, but I'm not talking about political conservative or political liberal. Rather, we're talking about theologically conservative or theologically liberal, the differences in our theology. There are different groups, lobby groups and caucus groups, that represent all 3 of the major theological positions throughout the United Methodist Church. So there are those that are conservative, traditionalist, or even what we might call evangelical. They're theologically conservative like that. On the complete opposite end of the spectrum are those who are theologically liberal or progressive. And then, kind of in a stuck-in-the-middle situation, are those who call themselves moderates or centrist. And they have their own groups, lobby groups for lack of a better name, caucuses, that represent them in the larger church and help guide them and advocate for them throughout. And so for the conservative traditional end, you have things like Good News, the Confessing Movement, Wesleyan Covenant Association. For the progressive and liberal end, you have the Reconciling Ministries Network, the Queer Clergy Caucus for the UMC, and a variety of others. And then for the moderates and centrists, you have UMC Next and Mainstream UMC and a handful of others like that. Each of these lobby groups sent their representatives, and they gathered together with Bishop Yambasu, and he sought to try to find some way of resolving the difficulty we have. We're at an impasse. How do we get through it? And as they talked and discussed, and I'm sure even argued a little bit, it became very clear over the next few days that there really was no way around it. What they regretfully concluded was that we had irreconcilable differences, and that there was no way for especially the more conservative end of the church and the more liberal progressive end of the church to really live in the same church together. They're simply wanting to go 2 different directions, and well, there's no way to be one church with that. There's no way to be faithful to the scriptures in the way that conservatives want to, and then to be fully inclusive in the way that liberals want to. It's just not possible to make both of those work in the same denomination. And so they sadly concluded that we might need to think about breaking up the United Methodist Church. And so as they began to talk that out, they reached out and they got a professional mediator. And they got the group down to a smaller number that made it easier to talk and negotiate. And that negotiator led them through a process over a period of weeks and months to come up with some way forward out of this, some way of amicably separating and dividing the United Methodist Church. And what they came up with is what ended up being called the Protocol. Now, you've probably heard that term, the Protocol, before. In late 2019, they came up with what was called the Protocol for grace and reconciliation through separation. Now, as I've teased before, that's a Methodist title if ever there were one. Only Methodists would give something a name such as that. It's just who we are. But we called it the Protocol for Grace and Reconciliation through Separation. In short, we just call it the Protocol, or the Protocol for Separation. But what it was a way of amicable separation. It was a way of graciously and kindly, and even hopefully generously, dividing up the denomination. Now, to be clear, it was a compromise. Every group had to give up something. The conservative, the liberal, even the centrist. Everybody had to compromise something. So that nobody was really entirely happy with the conclusion. They weren't entirely happy with the outcome, but they could live with it, and they agreed to move forward with it, which is usually the sign of a really good compromise. No one got everything they wanted. Everybody had to give up something. Everyone's a little unhappy with it, but they can live with what they've committed to. It was a good compromise. And as a part of it, every lobby group committed to advocate among their members to support the protocol and to vote at the next General Conference for the protocol. And the next scheduled General Conference was supposed to be in May of 2020. And it was widely believed and hoped that had we had the General Conference in 2020, it was expected that it would pass. You only need a simple majority for something of this kind to pass, and it looked like a simple majority was there. It looked like you would have the votes for the Protocol of Separation to pass and for the great and amicable separation of the United Methodist Church. A lot of people were optimistic about it back in 2020. Unfortunately, if you recall, March of 2020 happened, and we had COVID. And by March of 2020, most of the United States and parts of the world were in lockdown. We didn't even get Easter that year, if you remember. We didn't even get to gather here for Pentecost. We had to end up learning how to do live stream online church. The world changed. And so it was very clear in May of 2020, we couldn't hold a General Conference, a worldwide global gathering. Many of us can't get together in a local church building just to have Sunday worship. How on earth are we going to have General Conference? So we understandably, we postponed General Conference. So General Conference 2020 was postponed to really late August, early September of 2021. In fact, this very time of year. It was supposed to be like August 28th through September 10th or something like that of 2021, last year. And so we were hoping for that. But then if you remember right, back in March and the spring of 2021, right around the time when you have to make the decision, can we do this General Conference or not? Well, the Delta variant of COVID was sweeping through. And with the Delta wave coming through, well, it just didn't feel like you could have a global gathering. It would be too hard to get global delegates in. The vaccines were still new. Not everybody had access to vaccines. We just couldn't do a General Conference in 2021. So the Commission on General Conference that has to decide these things, in spring of 2021, they postponed it a second time. From 2021 to August, September of 2022. So understand, technically, General Conference 22 is supposed to be happening right now. It was supposed to have begun basically Monday, August 29th of 2022 through, I believe, of September 11th of 2022. We were supposed to be having this postponed General Conference. But then in March of this past year, March 3rd, they announced from the Commission on General Conference that they were going to postpone it a third time. Now remember, we've already postponed it twice, from 2020 to 2021. That was understandable. From 2021 to 2022, well, that still made sense. But then to postpone it from 2022, get this, not to 2023, but to May of 2024. Almost 2 years from now. Well, now that creates a problem. And their reasoning they gave was, well, we're still not done with COVID yet, and not everyone may have had access to vaccines. And truthfully, they said, it's just going to be too hard for everyone to be able to get the visas to come from other countries into the United States. And so they made their appeal that it's just too early. Let's wait till 2024 and we'll do it then. Well, now that's where many people begin to ask questions. I'm one of those, I confess. I like to give people the benefit of the doubt, but I mean, every other major denomination that needed a national or global gathering, they've been doing it this year. For instance, the Anglican Church, the Church of England, just had what they call their Lambeth Conference over in, I believe it was London, England, which is a worldwide gathering of bishops and denominational leaders for the Church of England, the Anglican Communion. And people from all over the world came to England. Now, if you can get them into England, you can't tell me it's easier to get into England than it's easier to get into the United States of America. I realize we can make things hard at times, but I kind of believe that if we wanted to get visas for our people, we could have gotten them here. In fact, a lot of our foreign delegates from places like Africa and the Philippines, they said just that. Everybody who wanted to get vaccinated had been vaccinated. All of our delegates that wanted it got it. The few that didn't, well, they weren't going to get vaccinated anyway, and so that's on them. And visas? No, they didn't have them back in March, but they fully believed they could have had them by this summer. They certainly would have had them in time to get in August. Certainly there are always a few, especially from some of the countries in Africa that have a hard time getting into the U.S. That happens every General Conference. On average, sadly, 30 or 40 of our African delegates just can't work out the visa issues to get into the United States for whatever the reason. But with that exception, we really felt like they could have gotten the delegates in. And again, if they could hold the Lambeth Conference in England, there's a good argument we could have held the General Conference here. But look, that was their decision. They made it. And as a result, it kind of moved us forward a step. We're now in this limbo where we're waiting till 2024 for the next General Conference. Now keep in mind, it's been since 2016 that we've had our last regularly called General Conference. Our denominational budget for the General Church was last set in 2016. The number of bishops assigned to the United Methodist Church in America, in Africa, the Philippines, Europe, all of that was last set back in 2016. We haven't done church business since 2016. If we wait till 2024, it's going to be 8 full years since we've met as a General Conference. But that's the decision they made. And so we're waiting. Now, in the interim, a number of things have happened as we're waiting for that next General Conference. And so we want to review a couple of these. One of them is, and I don't have it on this slide, but I want you to know it before we get to that slide, that shortly after the announcement that they were postponing General Conference, there were some connected with the traditional side who said, that's just too long. We're not sure that was a legitimate decision, and they're not going to wait any longer because there's some churches that just can't wait. And so what they did is they went ahead and launched what would end up being the Global Methodist Church. Now, note back to what we were talking about, back with the protocol for separation. Part of the compromise was, very sadly, they agreed that it would be the traditional churches and the traditional leaders and pastors that would leave the United Methodist Church. That would be the progressives and the centrists that, as part of the protocol, would inherit the United Methodist Church. And then the conservatives and traditionalists, they would be the one to leave the United Methodist Church, and through the protocol, they would start a new traditional Methodist denomination to be named later. And provisions were made for how that would work. Well, in the interim, from 2019 to now, the traditionalist leaders have been working on what the framework of that denomination would look like. They'd even come up with a name for it, the Global Methodist Church. They never activated it. They never launched it because they were waiting on the protocol to pass. But now that you're going to have to wait 2 more years for the protocol to pass, they said, well, why wait? So they went ahead and launched it on May 1st of 2022 this year. So there's now a global Methodist Church that's at work. That accelerates what's going on in our United Methodist Church. Now traditional churches that are leaving actually have a denomination that's really a conservative United Methodist group to go to. That leads to the other things that have happened in our interim. Judicial Council rulings. The Judicial Council is our version of the Supreme Court. They have made a couple of different rulings that are significant. One of them is they have said no annual conference can withdraw from the United Methodist Church. Now they did this a little bit belatedly because as annual conferences were gathering in the late spring of 2022 over in Eastern Europe, the Bulgaria and Romania annual conference, a small conference, but a gathering in Eastern Europe, Bulgaria and Romania, they voted unanimously over the objections of their bishop to withdraw as an annual conference from the United Methodist Church. Now, Romania will back out of that, and they still want to withdraw, but they said they would work a little bit longer with the United Methodist Church, and so they're still United Methodist for the moment. But Bulgaria said, no, we're not waiting, we're gone. And so they went ahead and made it final. They've changed their constitution, they've adjusted their bylaws, they've even elected a new person to lead them as their bishop, resigned in essence. And so they are actually now a part of this global Methodist Church. But the Council of Bishops appealed that. Well, can annual conferences legitimately withdraw? And what the Judicial Council said is, no, they may not. And actually, their ruling is a little more complicated. If I understand it correctly, I confess I may not, but if I understand it correctly, what they said is, yes, the Book of Discipline says an annual conference may vote to withdraw from the United Methodist Church. You have the right to vote to withdraw. However, they said, an annual conference does not have the right to act on what they just voted. Now let me say that again. If I understand correctly, what they've said is, you have the right to vote to withdraw, but you don't have the right to act on your vote to withdraw without further guidance and help from the General Conference. So a General Conference has to meet and outline exactly how the process of withdrawal would work, and then you may act on your vote. So you have to wait until 2024 for a General Conference to tell you how that would work in legal constitutional terms. Now look, I'm not one to question the Judicial Council most of the time. I'm not even sure I understand all the legal standing of their ruling. So perhaps they're right. Maybe that is the best reading of it. But it does raise an eyebrow on it. We have the right to vote, but we don't have the right to act on what we voted? Well, then why do we have the right to vote? If we can't do it, why is it in the Book of Discipline that we can vote to do it? Anyway, that was the question, but they say no. So, for the time being, no annual conference in the United States especially can legally withdraw as an annual conference from the United Methodist Church. That means in particular for us in Mississippi, we could not gather at annual conference and vote as an annual conference to withdraw from the United Methodist Church. That just can't be done. So that's one ruling. The second ruling was, yes, jurisdictional conferences can meet. Now look, it's been since 2016 that we've had General Conference. There's an interesting rule in the Book of Discipline. If I understand correctly, our pattern's always been, in about May of a year, you have a General Conference. And then, usually in July or August of that same year, you have jurisdictional conference. Remember, jurisdictions are our regional gatherings. We're the southeastern jurisdiction. Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, Florida, the Carolinas, Virginia, Kentucky, all of us are a part of the southeastern jurisdiction. And every 4 years after General Conference, the southeastern jurisdiction meets in Lake Junaluska, North Carolina, and among other things, they elect new bishops. And then they assign those bishops to whichever annual conference they're going to serve for the next 4 years. But the rule typically is you can only have jurisdictional conference after you've had a general conference. Well, that raises a question. If we can't have general conference until 2024, well then we can't have jurisdictional conference in 2024, can we? Well, that creates another question we've got, because we've got a lot of bishops who need to retire. For instance, our bishop here in Mississippi, Bishop Swanson, has been really good to us. But he's over the age of 72, which is the mandatory retirement age. And not only is he over the retirement age, he'd really like to retire. He's told us for a couple years now he'd like to be able to retire from being bishop. He served us for 10 years very faithfully. He's wanting to retire this year. We need a new bishop. So there are a number of bishops who are retiring or have retired, and we really do need to elect new bishops. But without a jurisdictional conference, you can't elect bishops. So the Council of Bishops asked the Judicial Council, or Supreme Court, to rule on whether we can actually hold a jurisdictional conference this year. Now keep in mind, the book of discipline says you can only hold it in the same year you've had a general conference. Technically, if you don't have a general conference in 2022, well, then you can't have a jurisdictional conference in 2022. You have to wait till 2024 when the next general conference is. However, when the Judicial Council got together, what they decided was, yes, you may. You can have a jurisdictional conference in each jurisdiction in 2022, and you can elect new bishops. Now, I'm not one to question Judicial Council typically, but I do raise an eyebrow on that, because technically that's not what the Book of Discipline says. And what we've actually got the Judicial Council doing is they're making a ruling of law here, where they're actually making the law. They're writing a new law by this ruling, that even though you haven't had a general conference, you may, under extraordinary circumstances, hold a jurisdictional conference. Now look, I find myself torn between this. On the one hand, I don't think that really fits with the Book of Discipline. On the other hand, we really do need to elect new bishops, because otherwise, someone else has to serve their annual conference and Mississippi's annual conference at the same time for at least 2 more years. It's a long time to be interim bishop handling 2 or more annual conferences. That just doesn't seem reasonable, so we really do need new bishops. So, right or wrong, good or bad, the Judicial Council has ruled you may hold jurisdictional conferences. So we're going to have them. In November 2nd through 4th of this year, our southeastern jurisdiction will meet in North Carolina at Lake Junaluska, and they will elect new bishops. Technically, we're allowed to elect 5 bishops because we've had 5 retiring. But there's a little bit of a discussion if we'll only elect 3 instead of our normal 5. But regardless of how they do on that, technically what's supposed to happen is Bishop Swanson will retire at the end of 2022, so his technical last day is December 31st of this year. And then in November, they'll have elected new bishops, and we'll know who our new bishop is going to be. And January 1st of 2023, we in Mississippi will receive a new bishop assigned to us. At least that's the plan at the moment. So that's what's supposed to be coming our way. That's where we're at this time. So that creates a little bit of anxiety. Who's our new bishop? What kind of bishop are we going to get? Bishop Swanson's been really good to us for 10 years. He has served us incredibly well. Truthfully, I'd be glad to have him serve us for 2 or 3 more years. But we're going to get a new bishop in January. Will this be a good bishop or a bad bishop? Will this be someone like Bishop Swanson? Or will it be someone who's, well, maybe not the best for us? A lot of questions there. Creates a little bit of anxiety and uncertainty, the unknown of what's going on. However, the other factor that's gotten us to where we are right now is, again, because of the postponement of General Conference, the launching of the Global Methodist Church in May of 2022, there have been a number of churches that started to leave the United Methodist Church by one way or another. Now, oddly enough, we in Mississippi are actually the beginning of that, long before 2022. If you remember back in 2017, we actually had the first 2 churches leave the United Methodist Church by this odd mechanism. After the 2016 General Conference, there were a couple of our pastors here in Mississippi said, we've seen all we need to see. The United Methodist Church isn't going the direction we can trust in. We don't want to be United Methodist anymore as a church. And so the Orchard United Methodist Church in Tupelo and Getwell Road UMC in South Haven, they both said, we want out. And they asked to withdraw from the United Methodist Church, and using their debt that they had as leverage, they were able to negotiate an exit from the United Methodist Church. And so they left our Mississippi Annual Conference back in 2017. I would suggest to you and remind you that that was the shot heard around the world in the United Methodist Church. There were a whole lot of churches and bishops, nationwide and worldwide, that all suddenly looked up and said, hold on, wait, what? What's going on in Mississippi? But we were the beginning of this thing where churches are leaving the United Methodist Church because they simply disagreed what's going on in the denomination. There may have been others before it, but these were the ones that got everybody's attention. We were at the forefront of this. 2018, you'll remember Louisville First UMC tried to follow their pattern and to do the same thing. Only, for whatever reason, Bishop Swanson and our conference leadership, they argued with them on that. Now I won't get into their reasonings. They have well stated their reasonings for it, and I'm not going to disagree with them. They've got their reasons, and they feel like they're well justified for it. But it got ugly, and one side was angry, and the other side got angrier, and next thing you know, they're filing lawsuits, and we ended up in court over the whole thing. It was kind of ugly, and it stayed in court for, I think, a year or two before it got negotiated a settlement out of court, and they gave release to Louisville First, and they're now in their same building, being Louisville First Methodist Church, but there is no longer a Louisville First United Methodist Church. That's gone now. We closed that down just in the last annual conference of 2021. But that's the next church that left. Thankfully, after Louisville, every other church that left under better circumstances, more along the lines of the Orchard and Getwell Road. Most of the churches that have left afterward did it in a friendly and more gracious way. And we as an annual conference were able to reciprocate in a more friendly and gracious way. By my loose count, if I understand correctly, and forgive me, my number could be slightly off, but as of this last July, I believe we've had 55 churches total leave, maybe as many as 60, depending on how you count them. So we've had 55 churches in Mississippi leave. But there have suddenly been a large number nationwide that have begun to exit the United Methodist Church. Just this annual conference season, we have had 311 churches do what we call disaffiliate from the United Methodist Church throughout the United States, throughout the different annual conferences that were held in May, June, and July. That's 311 different churches that were leaving. It's a massive wave. Now, you may not be able to see this slide very well, but I do just want you to see this is a breakdown by, as best I have it, every annual conference in the United States as of this annual conference season for just those that disaffiliated. And you can see the different numbers that are there. And there's a story to each of those numbers and each of those churches and each of those annual conferences. The other thing I want you to note is that other column. There are special called sessions of annual conference upcoming. One, the South Georgia one's already been held at this point. And these are so that annual conferences can approve the next wave of churches that are wanting to disaffiliate. We have asked our incoming new bishop, whenever that bishop comes in, to grant us a special called session in December of 2023 so that the last wave of churches can exit by that special annual conference. But there is another wave of annual conferences coming up where local congregations will be able to disaffiliate. And the number and list of those is growing by the day. This is kind of our setting. This is where we are right now. There is a divide happening. There are churches leaving. There's apparently a process and means called disaffiliation for churches to leave. The Global Methodist Church has launched. Churches are joining it. There are other churches that are leaving to join things like the Free Methodist Church. Others simply going and becoming independent churches of their own right. There is hopefully going to be in May of 2024 another general conference, but all of that's kind of up in the air. So this is where we are right now, and this is roughly how we got here. And so that kind of gives you a quick big picture view of what's going on in our United Methodist Church up to this point, how we got to this place, and why some of our conversations are going on throughout the United States and even Mississippi and within our congregation the way they are. This is why that word disaffiliation has become so popular. In the next session, we're going to look at what that disaffiliation paragraph is and how it works, as well as what some of the other means of exit are. So I hope you'll join me for that next video when it comes along. In the interim, if you like this video, if you found this helpful, I would ask you to hit the like button down below. If you'd like to see more of this content, this is our church YouTube channel. So if you're not already, I'd encourage you to subscribe to it so that you get automatic notification when these get released. Likewise, if you have a question or a comment, I would encourage you to put that in the comments section down below. I will do my best to read and respond to those as I am able. But if you'd like us to address another topic along the way that comes to your mind going, I have a question about this, Pastor, would you answer that question? I will do my best to answer that. And especially I'd encourage you within our congregation, if you have a question, call me, text me, drop by the office and talk to me. Contact the church office and they can get us in contact. My door is open. I am here to resource you and help you navigate whatever your thoughts, questions, and concerns are during this time as we prayerfully discern what path God may lead us down as a local congregation. So that's our plan for the time being. Next time we're going to talk about what the disaffiliation paragraph is and how it works. Till then, hope to see you next time. God bless.